Hello, in this video I am going to remove the dashboard for a 1993 Nissan 240SX, and as you can see my dashboard has cracks, many cracks. In this video there are going to be some parts that are already removed. For example, the steering column, case cover, and steering column bottom cover are already removed. These parts are missing, so I will not be able to remove them in this video. To start, I'm going to remove the steering wheel. I'm going to remove the rubber cover of the horn and then remove the horn button. Then a metal bracket will be exposed, which I will also remove, which requires a Phillips screwdriver for 4 screws. Now I'm going to remove the bolt holding down the steering wheel. It's important to lock the steering wheel before removing the bolt, because without locking it, removal of the bolt will also turn the steering wheel and making the bolt all the more difficult to remove. Once the bolt is removed, mark the position of it, but use a more appropriate marking tool and not a ballpoint pen. For example, some whiteout or a paint marker would work great. Now that the bolt is off and marked, the steering wheel is ready to come off. I used a puller to remove it. The puller set that I have comes with a set of screws to grip the steering wheel. I just used the correct size screws, then I got a ratchet to tighten the puller down to loosen the steering wheel to remove it. The puller set that I have came with washers, so I used it for the screws to have a better base on the puller. This is how I set up my puller for the steering wheel. All it needs now is to be tightened down to loosen the steering wheel. I'm turning the main bolt of the puller clockwise with a ratchet and the correct size socket. I'm just turning the puller tight enough just to loosen the steering wheel. Once the steering wheel is loose, I can loosen and remove the entire steering wheel by hand. So on to the next part that needs to come off is the glove compartment. Keep in mind that there is a frame that comes out together with the glove box. Once the hinges on the side of the compartment is loose, screws near the bottom will be exposed. Once all the set screws are removed, the glove box can come off. Once all the screws are removed, the compartment should come out easily. There are screws on the left side of the dashboard and screws on the right side near the bottom by the door. The screw I'm removing here is the driver's side. Now this is the right side or the passenger side screw, which is located near the bottom. The instrument cluster is also another component that has to be removed. There are 2 screws holding down the unit. In order to get to the screws for the cluster, the component or cluster lid that is holding the flip-up light switch, defroster switch, and things like that, that thing has to come loose though. In order to remove the cluster lid, I had to lower the steering column a little bit. I believe there are 4 screws holding down the steering column, and once the screws are off, it should move down more freely. If you don't unbolt the steering column, it may be very difficult to remove the cluster lid. Keep in mind that an older car will have more fragile parts due to its older parts. The parts are very sensitive, and I don't think it's worth the risk to try and remove the cluster lid without lowering the steering column. All it takes is just to loosen a few bolts to lower the column, and that's it. It's pretty straightforward to remove those bolts, and it's worth the extra time and effort to remove those bolts to lower the chances of breaking the cluster lid. And just as a reminder is to be careful with all the parts. These parts are sensitive and can easily break. Here's one of the bolts holding down the steering column. I believe there should be about 4 bolts holding the column down. Once the bolts are loosened, the column should be free to move down. It doesn't have to go all the way down to the floor, but just enough so that there is enough space to remove the cluster lid. Even with the steering column down and out of the way, it might still be kind of tricky to remove the cluster lid, but it will definitely be a lot easier versus if it was not down. So when removing it, just wiggle it and play around with it until it can come off. If you had the plugs still connected to the switches, remove those too. Just as a reminder, those may be on there tight too. Once the lid is removed, the instrument cluster can also be removed. And when all of the components are out, I would put back the steering column how it was so that it won't just be hanging around. I also wouldn't want the steering column to bend or anything like that. Also remove this side panel. There are also some bolts near the top by the vents. Be very careful when removing vents though. The vents may be very fragile and can easily break. The next thing I am going to remove is the center console. There are 2 screws, one on the right and one on the left. On the sides towards the front. There are 2 screws also located near the top, and again there is going to be one on the left and one on the right. There are also another set of screws near the back of the center console, which will have a screw located on the right side and another screw on the other side. The passenger seat will have to be moved forward so that the screw will be more exposed for easier access. And the same goes for the driver's side. The console can come off. It should be able to come off easily with minimal effort. And don't forget to remove the cigarette lighter connector if that's still connected. I have to say, I have a huge mess underneath the center console, and yours will probably not look like this. Up next is the control panel. There are 4 screws holding this down, and once the screws are removed, the control panel can just be pushed in. It just needs to be pushed in out of the way, and it does not need to be completely removed from the car. And don't forget to store your screws in an appropriate place where you will not forget where they are. On the other hand, the radio does need to be completely removed. Because of the way the radio is installed, if the radio is not completely removed, the dashboard will not be able to be removed. The radio has 2 screws holding it down, and once the screws are removed, the radio will also have to be completely removed. As you're removing the dash, check around for anything that may be preventing it from coming off. For example, this cable that powers on the glove compartment light. Disconnect that cable because it's connected to the dash, which prevents it from coming off. Same goes for other parts that may be connected. Check for the air vents that are attached. Check. If you know that everything is unbolted, such as all the screws and bolts, the dashboard can come off. There might be some needed effort, so just wiggle it around and play with it, and it'll eventually come off. Just as a quick tip, the passenger door and driver door should be open. Without these being open, the dash will be difficult to remove. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you have found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.